The phone rang at 3:42 a.m. Margaret Walsh had been sleeping lightly, the way she had for 40 years now, one ear always listening for a call that never came, until tonight. Her hand found the receiver in the darkness, muscle memory from thousands of nights spent within arm's reach of the bedside telephone. "Mrs. Walsh?" The voice was female, professional, careful. "This is Detective Ramona Ortiz with the Montana State Police Cold Case Unit." Margaret sat up slowly, her spine straightening against the headboard. The room was cold. October in Clearwater County had always been cold, but the chill she felt now came from somewhere deeper. "We've made an arrest in your daughter's case." The world around her shifted, tilting on its axis. 40 years of waiting compressed into a single moment of suspended breath. "Who?" Margaret asked, her voice thin in the darkness. "Gerald Thorne." The name landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Gerald Thorne, owner of Timber Pines Mill, deacon at First Lutheran, the man who had organized search parties when Caroline disappeared, the man who had kept a photograph of her daughter in his wallet for 4 decades. Outside her window, the first snow of the season began to fall. What had begun on a warm September morning in 1983, on a dirt road leading to Timber Pines Mill, was finally coming to an end. Clearwater County, Montana, 1983, a place where mountains cast long shadows across valleys thick with lodgepole pine and western larch. The logging industry was the heartbeat of the county, pumping economic life through a network of small towns scattered like wood chips across the wilderness. Timber Pines Mill stood at the center of it all, smokestacks rising above the tree line, visible for miles in every direction. Caroline Walsh was 22 that summer, home from her 3rd year at the University of Montana in Missoula. She was studying forestry and environmental science, a choice that raised eyebrows in a county where cutting trees put food on tables. But Caroline had always been stubborn and idealistic in equal measure. She kept her textbooks stacked neatly on her childhood desk, color-coded tabs marking pages about sustainable logging practices and forest management. "You can have both," she would tell her father, a career logger himself. "Healthy forests and healthy communities. It doesn't have to be one or the other." She wore her auburn hair in a practical braid that reached halfway down her back. Her hands were calloused from summers spent planting seedlings with the Forest Service. She drove a second-hand blue Toyota pickup that complained loudly when shifted into 3rd gear. She collected polished stones, keeping them in a mason jar on her windowsill where morning light would catch their colors. She sang off-key to John Denver songs when she thought no one was listening. Margaret always described her daughter as sunshine in blue jeans, bright, warm, impossible not to notice. Caroline Walsh filled rooms with her presence, not through volume or drama, but through the sheer force of her engagement with the world around her. That summer, she'd secured an internship at Timber Pines Mill. "Know your opponent," she joked to her mother, though the truth was more complicated. Caroline believed in finding middle ground, in learning the business from the inside before proposing changes. Gerald Thorne had personally approved her application, telling the local paper it showed forward thinking to bring environmental perspectives into the industry. The Walsh family lived in a white 2-story house on Juniper Street, with a wide front porch where Caroline and Margaret would sit in the evenings, drinking tea and watching thunderstorms roll in from the mountains. The house had been in the family for generations, the porch added by Caroline's grandfather, the kitchen remodeled by her father. The floorboards creaked in specific places that the family navigated instinctively, like sailors who know exactly where to step on a familiar deck. Clearwater County operated on patterns and rituals. Breakfast at Dot's Diner, where the special was always biscuits and gravy on Wednesdays. Friday night high school football games that emptied the streets as surely as an air raid siren. Sunday services at First Lutheran or St. Mary's, followed by potluck lunches where casserole recipes were guarded like state secrets. The annual Timber Festival in August, with its axe-throwing competitions and chainsaw sculptures. The mill whistle that marked shifts changing, a sound so embedded in the town's consciousness that children would announce 3 o'clock seconds before it blew. The summer of 1983 had been unusually warm and dry. Fire danger signs posted at the edges of national forest land had been stuck on extreme since mid-July. The mountains had a hazy quality from distant wildfires, the sun appearing as an orange disk through the smoke. The smell of burning pine hung in the air, mingling with the ever-present scent of fresh sawdust from the mill. Caroline drove to Timber Pines Mill every morning at 7:30, her blue Toyota kicking up dust on the access road. She carried a leather satchel that had been a graduation gift, filled with notebooks and environmental impact studies she was quietly conducting on her own time. She packed her lunch in a metal box with cartoon characters she'd kept since elementary school, an endearing contradiction to her serious academic pursuits. "Your generation will fix what mine broke," Gerald Thorne told her once, standing on the observation platform overlooking the main floor of the mill. He was in his early 40s then, with a thick beard and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His family had founded Timber Pines 3 generations back. He coached Little League on weekends and led the annual Christmas charity drive. His wife taught piano to half the children in town, including Caroline when she was young. September 17th, 1983, was a Saturday. Caroline wasn't scheduled to work, but she told her mother she wanted to collect some final samples for a water quality study she was conducting along Mill Creek, which ran behind the Timber Pines property. She left home at 9:13 a.m. Margaret remembered checking the clock because she was timing a batch of blackberry preserves, the kitchen filled with sweet steam from the boiling fruit. "Back for lunch," Caroline had called, the screen door slapping shut behind her. Margaret heard the Toyota's engine turn over twice before catching, then the familiar sound of gravel crunching under tires as her daughter backed down the driveway. That was the last time Margaret Walsh saw her daughter. The first 24 hours after Caroline's disappearance unfolded like a familiar tragedy in a small town. The initial concern, tempered by practical explanations, car trouble, a spontaneous detour to visit friends in Missoula, poor reception in the mountains preventing a call home, the growing worry as evening approached and the blue Toyota remained absent from the driveway, the first calls to friends, then to hospitals. The formal missing persons report filed with Sheriff Dawson at the county office as midnight approached. "Girls her age take off sometimes," Sheriff Dawson had said, not unkindly, but with the confidence of a man who had seen this scenario play out before. "They need space, they come back. But not Caroline, not this time." By Sunday afternoon, search parties were forming in the parking lot of First Lutheran. Gerald Thorne arrived early, passing out maps he'd marked with grid patterns for systematic searching. He brought coffee and donuts from Dot's Diner for the volunteers. His voice was steady as he addressed the crowd. "Caroline is one of our own," he said, standing on the bed of his pickup truck so everyone could see him. "We don't leave our own lost in these mountains." For 3 days, volunteers combed the forests around Mill Creek. They found Caroline's blue Toyota parked at a trailhead a mile from the mill, her keys still in the ignition, her leather satchel on the passenger seat. Inside the satchel were her notebooks, water testing kits, and a half-eaten granola bar wrapped in wax paper. Everything looked normal, undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle. The only thing missing was Caroline herself. On the 4th day, they found her yellow rain jacket tangled in branches along Mill Creek, nearly a mile downstream from where her car had been parked. The creek was running high from late summer storms in the mountains. When they recovered the jacket, Margaret recognized the stone in the left pocket immediately, a piece of rose quartz Caroline had found while hiking the previous spring. She kept it as a lucky charm. The fact that it was still in the pocket felt significant somehow. Caroline wouldn't have gone anywhere willingly without it. Sheriff Dawson called in state resources. Divers searched Mill Creek and the reservoir it fed into. Helicopters from the National Guard scanned the dense forest from above. Tracking dogs followed scents that led in circles or disappeared altogether. "We're doing everything humanly possible," Sheriff Dawson told Margaret on the 7th night, sitting at her kitchen table, his hat in his hands. The lines around his eyes had deepened. "I promise you that." Gerald Thorne visited the Walsh home every evening that week, bringing food prepared by his wife and updates from the volunteer search efforts he continued to coordinate. He sat with Margaret and her husband Frank, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories about Caroline's work at the mill. "She was going to change things," he said once, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw possibilities the rest of us were blind to." 2 weeks after Caroline disappeared, a hiker found her backpack wedged between rocks 3 miles downstream from where the jacket had been recovered. The backpack contained her wallet, identification, and the Polaroid camera she often carried. The film inside was ruined by water damage. The discovery shifted the prevailing theory from missing person to tragic accident. The evidence suggested Caroline had somehow fallen into the creek and been swept away. The search for a living person became a search for remains, but they never found her body. As weeks turned to months, the searches became less frequent. The story moved from the front page of the Clearwater County Register to the inside pages, then to occasional mentions, then to nothing at all. Life in the small town reluctantly moved forward around the Walsh family's grief. Frank Walsh returned to work at the lumber yard, his shoulders stooped under invisible weight. Margaret maintained Caroline's room exactly as she'd left it that September morning. Notebooks stacked on the desk, clothes hanging in the closet, polished stones catching morning light on the windowsill. She would sit there for hours, breathing in the fading scent of her daughter's shampoo, running her fingers over the spines of textbooks filled with Caroline's neat handwriting in the margins. Every year on September 17th, Gerald Thorne organized a memorial hike along Mill Creek. Every year fewer people attended. By the 5th anniversary, only the Walshes, the Thornes, and a handful of Caroline's closest friends made the solemn journey. By the 10th, even some of those had moved away or moved on. The town changed around the absence. The old sheriff retired. A new one took his place. The Timber Festival was discontinued when the recession of the early 1990s hit the logging industry hard. First Lutheran got a new roof. Mill Creek was dammed in a different section, creating a new reservoir for the county's water supply. Timber Pines Mill modernized, replacing men with machines, reducing its workforce by half. Gerald Thorne remained a constant. His children grew up, went to college, moved to cities. His wife passed away from cancer in 1997. He expanded the mill's operations, adapted to changing markets, kept the business alive when others failed. He became something of a patriarch in the county, serving on the school board, funding the new library, quietly paying funeral expenses for families who couldn't afford them. He kept a photograph of Caroline in his wallet, showing it sometimes to new employees at the mill as he told them about the bright young woman who'd wanted to revolutionize the industry. Meanwhile, Margaret Walsh lived in a suspended state, not quite moving forward, not entirely trapped in the past, but existing in the liminal space of uncertainty. Without a body to bury, there was no grave to visit, no concrete place to direct her grief. Just questions that hung in the air, unanswered. Frank passed away in 2002 from a heart attack while shoveling snow from their driveway. Margaret found herself alone in the White House on Juniper Street, surrounded by memories and silence. She volunteered at St. Mary's thrift shop 3 days a week. She tended her garden in the summers. She baked pies for new families that moved to town. She lived, but always with one ear listening for the phone, one eye watching the driveway for a blue Toyota that never returned. Technologies changed. Investigations evolved. Cold cases from the 1980s were reopened across the country as DNA testing became more sophisticated. But Caroline's case remained just that, cold. With no body, no crime scene, and no suspects, there was little for modern forensic science to work with. Until 2019, when Sheriff Rebecca Martinez established Clearwater County's first cold case unit. Sheriff Martinez was an outsider, having moved to Montana from Arizona 5 years earlier. She brought with her new perspectives and methodologies that sometimes ruffled feathers in the traditional community. Her decision to allocate resources to decades-old cases was questioned by the county commissioners, who saw more pressing needs for the limited budget. "The dead deserve justice too," was her simple response at the contentious town meeting. "And their families deserve answers." Detective Ramona Ortiz was brought in to head the cold case unit, another outsider, with experience working similar units in Washington state. She was methodical, patient, and unburdened by the community's established narratives around unsolved cases. Caroline Walsh was case number 3 in their files. Ortiz began by re-interviewing everyone still alive who had been connected to the original investigation. She reviewed faded reports and photographs, digitized handwritten notes from Sheriff Dawson, created new timeline charts on the walls of her small office. She spent hours walking the trails around Mill Creek, trying to see the landscape as it would have appeared in 1983, before the new dam, before the pine beetle infestation that had changed the forest composition, before 40 years of erosion had reshaped the creek bed. 6 months into her investigation, Ortiz requested a meeting with Margaret Walsh. They sat at the same kitchen table, where Sheriff Dawson had once sat with his hat in his hands. Margaret served tea in her good cups, the ones with roses painted along the rim that she saved for special occasions. At 78, her hands trembled slightly as she poured, but her eyes remained sharp, alert. "I'd like to ask about Gerald Thorne," Ortiz said carefully, warming her hands around the teacup. Margaret looked surprised. "Gerald? He was Caroline's biggest supporter. That's what everyone says," Ortiz nodded. "But I've found some inconsistencies in his statements from 1983. Small things, probably not important. I'd just like to clarify them." "Such as?" Margaret asked. "He told Sheriff Dawson he wasn't at the mill the day Caroline disappeared, that it was closed for equipment maintenance. But payroll records show 3 employees were working overtime that Saturday." Margaret frowned. "That doesn't sound like Gerald. He's always been so involved in Caroline's case." "That's precisely what interests me, Mrs. Walsh, his level of involvement." The conversation shifted something in Margaret's perspective, a subtle adjustment, like a photograph being brought into slightly sharper focus. She began to recall details that had seemed insignificant at the time. How Gerald had been the one to find Caroline's satchel in her car, though he wasn't officially part of that search team. How he had seemed to know which sections of the creek to search before others did. How he had kept her memory alive, yes, but also kept control of the narrative around her disappearance. That night, for the first time in decades, Margaret went into the attic and opened the boxes of Caroline's belongings that she'd eventually, reluctantly, removed from her daughter's room. Among them was the leather satchel Caroline had carried that final day, returned to the family after the initial investigation concluded. Margaret emptied its contents onto the living room floor, the water testing kits, the notebooks filled with Caroline's handwriting, the wrappers from her lunch, and tucked into an inner pocket, overlooked by investigators in 1983, a small tape recorder, the kind journalism students used for interviews. The tape inside had partially deteriorated. When Margaret pressed play, the sound was warped, distorted, but sections were clear enough. Caroline's voice, then Gerald Thorne's. They were discussing water samples taken from Mill Creek below the logging operation. Caroline's tone was professional but insistent. The mill was releasing chemicals into the watershed illegally. She had proof. Thorne's voice became harder to hear as the tape degraded, but certain phrases cut through clearly. "This would destroy everything my family has built. We can find another solution. No one would understand." The recording cut off abruptly. Margaret Walsh sat very still on her living room floor, surrounded by her daughter's belongings, as 40 years of certainty unraveled around her. The next morning, she called Detective Ortiz. The investigation accelerated after the tape was discovered. Search warrants were issued for Timber Pines Mill records dating back to the 1980s. Environmental violation reports that had been buried or dismissed were re-examined. Former employees were interviewed, many now elderly, some with guilty consciences looking for unburdening. A picture emerged of Gerald Thorne in 1983, not the community pillar celebrating a bright young intern, but a mill owner facing financial ruin if Caroline's findings became public. Water samples she'd collected showed chemical contamination far exceeding legal limits. The mill had been dumping treatment chemicals directly into Mill Creek for years, saving costs during a period when the logging industry was already struggling. Caroline's internship hadn't been a gesture of forward thinking, as Thorne had claimed to the newspaper. It had been damage control, keep your enemies closer. When she proved undeterrable, the situation had escalated. One former employee, now living in a nursing home in Missoula, provided the missing piece. Thorne had asked him to work that Saturday, though the mill was officially closed. He remembered seeing Caroline arrive, remembered her arguing with Thorne in his office, remembered Thorne following her when she left, agitated. The employee had gone home afterward, thinking nothing of it until Caroline was reported missing the next day. When he'd tried to tell Sheriff Dawson, Thorne had already established himself as the grieving mentor, the community leader organizing search efforts. The employee's concerns were dismissed, his work hours that day mysteriously absent from official records, later reviewed by investigators. "No one would have believed me," he told Detective Ortiz. "Thorne was Clearwater County. I was just a mill worker with a drinking problem and 3 kids to feed." Armed with the tape, the environmental reports and witness statements, Ortiz secured a warrant for more extensive searches. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to examine areas around the mill property that had been renovated or built over in the intervening decades. A concrete foundation poured for mill expansions in late 1983 showed irregularities. When they broke through the concrete, they found human remains, DNA testing confirmed what Margaret Walsh had feared and suspected since finding the tape recorder. Caroline had never left Clearwater County. She had never been swept away by Mill Creek. She had been buried beneath Timber Pines Mill for 40 years, while her killer organized memorial hikes in her honor. Gerald Thorne was arrested at his home, a dignified man of 79, respected throughout the county, his walls covered with community service awards. He offered no resistance, no explanations. His face, broadcast on local news as officers led him to the police car, showed no emotion at all, just the blank expression of a man who had carried a secret for so long that it had become part of his identity. The courtroom was packed for Gerald Thorne's arraignment. People stood along the back wall, craned their necks from the hallway. The case had exploded across state news, then national. A small-town tragedy resurrected from decades past. The mill owner who killed an environmental intern then led the searches for her body. The grieving mother who never gave up. The cold case detective who connected 40-year-old dots. Margaret Walsh sat in the front row, her back straight, her eyes never leaving Thorne as he entered in handcuffs. He had aged into a community elder, his beard now white, his shoulders slightly stooped. As he passed her row, he paused, turned toward her. "I kept her memory alive," he said quietly, his first words since his arrest. "That counts for something." Margaret's response was equally quiet, meant only for him. "You kept your secret alive, not my daughter." The legal process would stretch on for months, evidence to be examined, motions to be filed, a community to grapple with the revelation that their patriarch was not who they had believed him to be. But for Margaret Walsh, a different kind of process was beginning. The long-delayed journey from uncertainty to grief, to whatever came after. Caroline was finally laid to rest in the Clearwater County Cemetery on a clear October day in 2023, 40 years and 1 month after she disappeared. The yellow rain jacket, the rose quartz stone, the leather satchel with her notebooks were buried with her. Margaret had kept them all, preserved them all, waited for this day without knowing if it would ever come. The funeral was attended by hundreds, some who had known Caroline, many who had only known her story. Detective Ortiz stood at the back, watching as the community reclaimed a narrative that had been controlled for too long by the wrong person. Gerald Thorne pleaded guilty 2 months later, accepting a plea deal that would essentially guarantee he would spend the rest of his life in prison. In his statement to the court, he spoke about fear. Fear of losing his family's business, fear of disappointing the community that depended on Timber Pines for their livelihoods, fear that had turned to panic, panic to violence, violence to 40 years of lies. "I convinced myself I was protecting everyone," he said. "The town, the workers, even Caroline's memory. I was protecting no one but myself." Margaret Walsh did not attend the sentencing. She had said her piece at the funeral, standing beside her daughter's final resting place, surrounded by the community that had searched for Caroline, mourned her, and ultimately helped bring her justice. Instead, on the day Thorne was sentenced, Margaret drove her aging sedan up the dirt road to Timber Pines Mill, now closed indefinitely, its future uncertain. She parked where Caroline's blue Toyota had been found 4 decades earlier. She walked the trail along Mill Creek, now clean and clear after years of environmental remediation forced by the case's revelations. She carried a small jar filled with polished stones, the collection from Caroline's windowsill that she had maintained all these years, occasionally adding new ones she thought her daughter would have appreciated. One by one, she placed them along the creek bank, bright spots of color against the brown earth and green moss. The last stone was the largest, a piece of raw amethyst with purple crystals catching the autumn sunlight. Margaret held it for a long moment before setting it down. "It's done now," she said to the rushing water, to the swaying pines, to the daughter who had loved this place enough to die defending it. "It's finally done." That night, when the phone rang in Margaret Walsh's house, she let it go to the answering machine. Whatever it was, it could wait until morning. 40 years of listening for a call in the night had ended. Now she could simply sleep. Stories like Caroline's remind us that the passage of time does not erase the truth, only obscures it temporarily. Across America, thousands of cold cases wait in file boxes and computer databases. Families like the Walshes wait alongside them, suspended between grief and uncertainty. But cases are being solved decades later through new technologies, fresh perspectives, and the simple human refusal to forget. The justice that comes is always late, too late for many, But it carries with it a kind of closure that time alone cannot provide. Where were you when the Timber Pines case was finally solved? And how many more wait silently for their turn to be remembered?